When the war in Ukraine started, so for me, there are two components. One of them, there's something personal, so it was super hyper triggering. Um, but there was something very interesting that happened during the war, and that's when, at first everybody left the country, or especially not the women and the children. And so, everybody in all of our countries, we wanted to welcome them because we have trauma, passed on trauma from the war, which is like 2 days ago for us. It's so real, the stuff of World War II or the Civil War, that we have patterns and habits and paranoias and instincts to not say anything, to not have a voice. For example, because of the Civil War in Spain, because to say something meant you could be killed. My father's aunt was French resistance. She actually had 2 medals of Légion d'honneur. She saved and hid um, 2 American soldiers. And someone, from what my brother has investigated, I have an older brother who has spent years investigated what happened. She was denounced by a woman who disliked her, was jealous of her, possibly because there were some shenanigans with husbands. And she called the Gestapo on my great aunt, and my great aunt was sent to concentration camps. She spent 2 years there in Mauthausen and Mauthausen, 2 camps with the same name, and was liberated by the Americans. So the Americans and my family, and it comes from my father. I have a brother-in-law who's American, and my father held him in such high esteem just because of what happened in World War II and the liberation from the Americans, as we say it. But you have to understand, when the war in Ukraine started, and I'm sort of I'm rambling and going back to the subject. It was triggering for a lot of us in a real way. Even for me, my generation, we did not know the war. I'm 51, but it was my parents. You have to understand that we have closeness with their trauma, the things they've gone through, the things they haven't told us, the things we find out from others, the things that we start to put together, and the stuff that they have told us about the reality of what they experienced. And you start to, there's a stage of life where you start to realize that your parents were human beings. It's not just your parents. And you start to, understand a lot of things from another perspective of what they've been through. So they were starving, they knew destruction, all kinds of shenanigans, women, things. Anyway, lots of shit, because that's what war is. It's a lot of horror. They starved, they had to rebuild. So they were the generation of rebuilding. And so what they had in mind, it wasn't how much quality time I'm going to spend with my children and hugging them. They were actually pretty much dissociated from their emotions. The goal was to rebuild, to have some money, and to send your kids to have an education. That's what success was, and they succeeded in that sense. But when the war in Ukraine started, again, I digressed a lot, but let me go back to the war in Ukraine. It was super triggering. And I remember watching a lot of commentary from a lot of people. And then I saw Trevor Noah, who is a comedian, so it's not about getting offended by a comedian. I understand he's making a joke. But there were a lot of commentary from that kind of perspective, because there was a journalist in some British broadcast who was expressing, I mean, journalists, they have to do screen time. They're dumb sometimes, commenting on what is happening. And he was saying, look at all these people. They're like us. It's like us. And a lot of people were saying, look at these former colonizers. Now it's like karma has hit them. And I was baffled watching all of the commentaries online from people, because I was thinking, for me, my recent past is not colonization. I understand it can be for you because that's definitely a reality. So it's not about denying that. But my family history is that my mother was grabbed by a stranger, saved by a stranger, separated from her family, her sister as well. Lots of people died. The village was bombarded. My father had nothing. They grew up with nobody. Everybody was dead. And they had to rebuild. That was their life. They were refugees. They were separated. They had to go through a lot of stuff. So when people were doing all of this commentary for us in Europe, the war in Ukraine, my generation, we discussed it because we discussed it. Gen X, the unsupervised generation, we have a lot of stuff that, sometimes we blame on our parents, but our parents, they experienced stuff that just didn't parent us. They were just rebuilding, and that's all they thought about, not about how many hugs they were supposed to give us or, to be with us in quality time. So just to remember that all of that stuff is passed on from one generation to another. And for me, World War II, it's not something in the history books. I studied the rise of fascism. We were taught in school the methods they used, the propaganda, with a lot of details, the cartoons that they used, and all of that stuff. I grew up with that. There's another thing that I would like to mention in another video.